Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 243, The 14th Brooklyn. Last week, we continued our analysis series. We talked about James Longstreet and William Stark Rosecrans. This is another one of those episodes where you took a look at the two individuals, and you might on first glance have thought that they were quite different from one another, but when we took a little bit of a closer view, they seemed a lot more similar, perhaps, than they first appeared. And especially in the case of these two individuals, they definitely had their underrated performances, kind of background acting at certain points. They had their big failures as well, so they had a very nice parallel story. And even after the war, we saw that kind of continue as well. This week, we will continue our unit overviews. We're going to stick with the Union Army and talk about the 14th Brooklyn. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And of course, we have an episode that was recently posted. We talked about prisoners of war, and we did a memoir review of a prisoner of war, a Union POW that spent some time on Belle Isle in the Richmond area. So that was a little bit of a different take. We've done other memoir reviews. We've done other movie reviews as well. We're going back to the well of movie reviews next time. And actually, we're going to be doing an Errol Flynn movie here, and it's been a while. We did an Errol Flynn movie way back in the beginning of our Patreon ventures. If you recall, if you have been listening for a while, we did the Santa Fe Trail, and that was kind of like a John Brown sort of Western-ish style movie, and that had Errol Flynn in it. And we're going to do They Die With Their Boots On, which is a Custer movie. It does include his time in the Civil War as a younger man, right? And then it goes into his time serving in the 7th Cavalry. So we will be doing that one here coming up next month. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, again, we've done other movie reviews. We did a series review in Manhunt not too long ago. We've done other picture slideshows of modern day battlefields as well, showing what those look like today. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So far in these episodes, we have had only Union regiments, although one was from the South. You might be sitting there remarking on what a weird choice it is so far. I mean, Iron Brigade makes sense, right? But the 14th Brooklyn? Well, this is a Zouave regiment, and it certainly will not be the last Zouave regiment we will do. This was one of the first Zouave regiments I found an interest in, as they were one of a handful engaged not only at 1st Manassas, but also 2nd Manassas. In some of our previous episodes, I've talked about the personal significance that these battles hold for me, these being my first battlefields, so obviously a choice from both should make sense. But if we take that away, and the Zouave chasseur-style uniform away, then I think we still have a good option for a regiment to cover in these early episodes for unit histories. This would be our first Eastern regiment that we will be doing in this series, and they will participate in many of the major battles of the war. Starting in 1861, they will serve all the way until 1864 in Spotsylvania. The regiment will then muster out in 1864. Because this was originally a militia unit, though, the service would continue, and actually the regiment would be assigned to camp service during the Spanish-American War. This would make it unique compared to some of these other regiments as a result. The sons of some of the veterans would actually serve in the regiment during this brief conflict. But the significance is still there. Their experience will be very similar to that of your lower numbered regiments in this theater, who will sign on, see combat, and then are mustered out before the end of the war. Remember that by the time we get to Petersburg, there are quite a few replacement regiments, high numbers, former heavy artillery units, veteran outfits, and the such. I think maybe the reason why this could seem a little odd is that the 14th Brooklyn sees a lot of the similar action as the Iron Brigade. They are part of the 1st Corps. But I think there is also an opportunity here to point out a few things. Some of the service is fairly similar, but each unit has their own experience when compared to others, even sharing the same field, even sharing the same ridge, like McPherson's Ridge, or the same cornfield in Miller's cornfield, there outside of Sharpsburg. We are bound to have repeats as we move forward. I have a short list of units, some of which were across the field from one another, some of which have their own experiences that I think are worthwhile. So to have this fellow 1st Corps unit so close to the Iron Brigade, I think opens it up for that unique exercise to see the similarities and the differences, and how different battlefield experiences just can be. As pointed out in some source material I have seen, while the Iron Brigade was 1st Corps 1st Division, 2nd Brigade, the 14th was actually part of the 1st Corps 1st Division 1st Brigade, so if we are counting numbers, slightly ahead of our Midwestern friends. The 14th as a whole will have its generation unique to some of the other volunteer units that will pop up. They would see their origin as a militia unit in Brooklyn as mentioned. Brooklyn was quite a different place than some of our other rural locations that regiments have come from. While I do not want to necessarily continue to compare the New Yorkers to the Iron Brigade, in 1860 the population of Brooklyn was some 260,000, whereas the population in the entire state of Wisconsin was 775,000, Brooklyn being the 3rd largest city in the United States. As such, due to its location, there would be an influx of immigrants arriving, many German and Irish, who would join the militia outfit, which had been established in the 1840s. As you can imagine, many of the immigrants would be Democrats initially, not so keen on Lincoln at first. The 1st Regimental Commander, Alfred Wood, was actually a Democrat elected to be a tax collector, serving in the 1850s. One of the first lieutenants would be Edward Brush Fowler, eventual regimental commander. Companies would be made up of various individuals, including men from fire brigades, as you recall, those being the makeup of the Fire Zouaves, the 11th New York. They would see brief action during a period of unrest in the 1850s as riots sprang up, pitting Irish Catholics against know-nothings, not quite like Gangs of New York, if you have seen that movie, but still, you get the idea. When the war breaks out, the 14th would be involved in securing the Navy Yard, an important task. Remember yet again, there were those who were Southern in sympathy, or at least not Republican, and there were several warships stationed in New York. The shipyard would be the location for the eventual riots, and part of the attempt to burn down New York by Confederate agents, if you recall from our narrative episodes. What should be noted is that the regiment had adopted their uniform at this point and would continue to wear it throughout the war. They wore a chasseur, a Pied-style jacket, red trousers, and white gaiters. Dark blue jackets with red shirts, all one article of clothing, with buttons that were decorative, in other words. The 14th would move through Baltimore, being one of the regiments following the riot around the 6th Massachusetts, encamping around Washington, accompanying the 11th New York Fire Zouaves into Alexandria during the expedition that will see the death of their commander, Elmer Ellsworth. Attached to Porter's brigade of Hunter's division, the Brooklyn Regiment would be primed to get into the action. Porter, as we remember from the Battle of First Bull Run, would actually take over division command from the wounded Hunter. He would use the 14th in the piecemeal attacks on Henry House Hill. The Brooklyn Regiment would actually be engaged against Hampton's Legion for a time before withdrawing and then redeploying to move on Griffin's Lost Battery. If you actually remember from our first Bull Run Redux episode, we read an account from one of the individuals from Hampton's Legion, and they talked about how there was quite the heavy fire that they received, and that you can imagine it would have been partly from the 14th Brooklyn. In an event that is typical of the first major battle of the war, they would advance to within very close distance of the 33rd Virginia, which had developed a hand signal and a password to hopefully discern friendly regiments from the enemy. The rebels supposed that the New Yorkers had been given the signal, but soon realized their mistake when they were opened up on. Briefly, the 14th Brooklyn would be in possession of Griffin's battery, but a heavy fire from the enemy would force them to withdraw. A member of the regiment would describe his experience. We had scarcely advanced 100 yards, being on the double quick, when a large parrot shell came crashing through the trees and whizzing over our heads struck. It was then that a realization of battle began to dawn. We emerged into an open field, having thrown off everything that would impede our progress. Our show uniform was a quick mark for the enemy, and they were not slow to perceive it, for presently a battery of 6-pounders opened on us with solid shot. The consequence was no casualties and considerable ducking. We took possession in a small ravine in an open field, lay down, and then hoisted our colors to attract the enemy's fire, in order that the 69th New York might charge in the works in front. Casualties at this time, 2 killed and 8 wounded. We remained not long thus, when an order came to advance, which we did, in line of battle over warm fences, across ditches, and mud, up steep declivities too, when we were brought to a halt very suddenly by the enemy bringing a battery to bear on us with an enfilading fire. Our mouths were parched with the want of water and burning heat and dust, and smoke almost suffocated us. We marched by the flank up a precipitous road, and received our first volley of musketry, but coming from our columns by mistake, by taking us for the enemy, by which our loss was 1 killed and 5 wounded, making up to this time some 3 killed and 13 wounded, and not having fired a shot. We were immediately ordered by General Porter to advance to support Ricketts' battery. After exchanging a number of shots, the battery changed position and we were to charge the enemy's main works. On reaching the opposite summit, we were met by the 1st Fire Zouaves in disorder, having been charged by the renowned Black Horse cavalry of the enemy. Our line of battle was arranged, some of the Zouaves joining us thus. The brain, Wadsworth, came dashing, hat in hand, and seizing the end of our colors, led the charge to the cannon's mouth. Our Colonel Alfred Wood being wounded about this time, the 27th Volunteer New York came up on this time on our left, and not being supported in our rear, we were forced to retire after battling for an hour in the trenches, but only to renew the charge. As mentioned in the account, Colonel Wood would be wounded in the heavy fighting. The regiment would lose 46 killed and 34 wounded, which is fairly remarkable given that the casualty figures are skewed killed versus wounded, usually being the opposite that you see on most battlefields. Many papers, including the New York Tribune and the Brooklyn Daily Times, would assure readers of the good conduct of the regiment on a day marked by the rapid flight of most Northern forces. And we have one of those accounts here. It has been well known that the officers of the regular service have been looked with distrust upon militia and militia officers. In the late Mexican War, this feeling was at first shared by both Generals Scott and Taylor. But at one of Taylor's battles, he remarked that the difference between regulars and the volunteers was that the latter did not know when they were whipped, but would continue charging, while the regulars never charged over twice after being repulsed. The same holds good in this battle, the 14th having been charged the batteries 3 times, and would have continued charging had they received the least support, while the Marines, when ordered to support them, broke without firing a gun. It is to be hoped that the citizens of Brooklyn will remember the gallant 14th not only when they return home, but now, when the men, weary and worn from their late exertions and excitement, naturally feel that the justice has not been done them, that they having made 3 distinct charges twice on covered batteries, thus withdrawing the rebel fire upon themselves, and made several gallant rallies. I would here say to your readers that if any of them wish to join a regiment that has been tried and tested, both in officers and men, and that is the most exposed position, let them join the 14th, which has proved itself the banner regiment. The men of the regiment consider it an outrageous blunder, to say the least, that they should have been placed in the position they were, being surrounded by masked batteries and exposed to crossfire of muskets, every position so guarded that the first shot from the battery shut in their ranks. The rebels regarded them as completely hemmed in and directed all their efforts to cut them off. And one of the charges they shouted, "Now that we've got you, you red-legged rascals," or words to that effect. They did not have them, however, but had a great deal more than they wished. So obviously I wanted to read that because we still have this kind of, and you see it throughout the war too, I'm not saying that it necessarily goes away, but you still have this kind of taint that you have, especially amongst these early battles and this kind of early mentality and these individuals who had joined the war in the very beginning. And you don't want to necessarily be associated with that. And so there's a lot of individuals who want to set the record straight. So obviously the 14th Brooklyn definitely wants to set their record straight. I want to assure the readers at home that, hey, we're not like these other guys that ran away, right? As Confederate reinforcements arrived, the 14th Brooklyn would withdraw with the rest of the Union Army. It is actually worth mentioning Colonel Wood and his adventures after the battle, as he was wounded. Recall, if you will, there were some minor efforts to pursue the retreating Union forces, but mostly this was done with infantry, as there was not a whole lot of cavalry present besides Stuart's already engaged horse. Wood and a few members of the 14th would be captured by the rebels, the colonel being treated for his wounds by Southern surgeons. If you also recall, we talked about an early event in the war when it came to Confederate raiders. The CSS Savannah was captured, and instead of treating the crew as prisoners of war, the Lincoln administration considered trying them as pirates. Remember, this was also part of the complicated web that was the naval rules at the time. If the commerce raiders were considered part of a sovereign navy, this gave legitimacy to the Confederacy and thus legitimacy for foreign intervention and aid and the such. Kind of like those weird blockade rules, where if you lifted the blockade, you had to keep the port open. Not that really that was followed ever. But the Confederate government would be irritated at the prospect the crew of the Savannah would be hung as pirates, and thus went to the bank of prisoners they had on hand from First Manassas, picking out some of the higher-ranking officers that they had on hand that would likewise be marked for execution as potential reprisals. Colonel Wood would be one such name on the list. But we know this was avoided, and Wood would be exchanged for George Patton, Wood eventually being elected mayor of Brooklyn in 1864. The 14th would operate in late 1861 and early 1862 in Northern Virginia, doing some skirmishing with rebel cavalry. Reportedly, Jeb Stuart was impressed at a captured New Yorker who refused to give up information on the federal lines. Comically, the Brooklyn boys were not adept at cutting down trees for winter quarters, though. Remember two things. First, that winter quarters were going to be more permanent, so they were usually constructed at least of a log and earthen base for warmth. And also remember that the armies were a conglomeration of different backgrounds and cultures. In Brooklyn, one does not need to cut down trees, or at least they probably do not have as much of a need to cut down trees. But on the flip side of that, they are probably exposed to more germs that the rural communities would probably find harmful. While the 14th skirmished with Confederates, so too would they skirmish with the governor of New York. The governor was attempting to reorganize the militia units into state volunteer outfits, so the 14th would potentially be redesignated the 84th New York State Volunteers. The 14th, already having been established prior and having seen combat under that name, would reject this new number. You see, the 14th, along with a handful of other regiments, would remain militia regiments under federal service, so they had marched without being sent by the state of New York. They'd actually responded to Lincoln's initial call for volunteers on their own. So they would remain in that capacity. Much like the Iron Brigade, the 14th would be held off from participating in McClellan's Peninsula Campaign and subsequently the 7 Days. Instead, they were to remain in Northern Virginia, reportedly finding some Quaker guns on their positions, thought to be strongly held by Confederates. Remember that Joseph Johnson had set up defensively following First Bull Run in the northern part of the state, but he was stretched fairly thin. They would participate in some operations around Fredericksburg, as they will drop down with McDowell and the rest of his command. Originally slated to remain in Northern Virginia, McDowell was then potentially going to link up with McClellan in his attempt to take Richmond. But again, we can question if there would have been any number that would have been enough for Little Mac to assault the Confederate capital. As August of 1862 rolls around, the 14th would find themselves in King's Division, Hatch's brigade, along with other New York regiments. They would be part of Pope's new outfit, ready to take down Lee. The 14th, though, would not participate in the Battle of Cedar Mountain, but they would write of the Confederate shelling as they waited on their side of the Rappahannock River. The battle opened by the enemy commencing a shell on our camps on his side of the Rappahannock. And such a scampering you never saw or heard of. We were immediately ordered under arms and marched up the river a short distance, where we lay on our faces in the hot boiling sun till dark, and moved about a mile further upriver. All day, Thursday, all Friday, and all afternoon of Saturday, we lay exposed to the most deafening charges of artillery I ever conceived of. I cannot describe it. This would have been part of the artillery that is covering Jackson's move north. We may have briefly mentioned this in the main narrative, but it also makes enough of an impact on the soldiers that they wrote about it. There were several accounts from the Iron Brigade as well, as this was the first time many of them were under a sustained artillery barrage. Now, Hatch's brigade actually would march past the Bronner Farm before Jackson attacks and engages with Gibbon's brigade, mostly along with Doubleday. Hatch would hold his position along with the 14th, so not as to expose the flank of the marching Union column. Something that we have not really talked about is that this fight on the first day at the Bronner Farm or Gainesville is really flawed on both sides. For one, Jackson picks a sort of weird time to attack, and then he kind of does it so that he gives up his advantage in surprise and numbers. For the Union, it is really a soldier's fight where no reinforcements are deployed. So we can kind of understand why sometimes it is considered to be its own separate affair. The 14th were to participate in an action on the 29th, being thrown into a fight, Hatch now leading the division when Pope thought the Confederates were retreating. They were not, the 14th taking fire and sustaining a handful of casualties, including Colonel Fowler being wounded. This action would be known as the Battle of Groveton, Hatch having been sent to support Porter. Remember that Pope was displeased with Hatch, so he was sort of given the runaround. Hatch's division would run into Longstreet as his command arrived on the field, formed up for their attack on the 30th. The rebels were able to get an enfilading fire on the 14th, inflicting some 20 killed and 60 wounded. There would be some confusion as the New Yorkers were thinking they may have been connecting with friendlies. It does show Pope's ineptitude when it comes to the situation as it was developing on the ground. We talked about this in a recent episode, but he will still be kind of floundering and making assumptions as opposed to getting intel and evolving. The 14th would be thrown into action supporting Porter's command as they would assault the railroad cut on the 30th, but they would be repulsed with minimal casualties, having suffered pretty heavily the previous day. They would join the rest of the Union Army in their retreat from the field. This is also a situation where I think if you go to the battlefield itself and you can see, like, even though that Manassas does have some roads that are still pretty, heavily trafficked roads that are being cut through, kind of the middle of it, right? You still can go and see where there is a 14th Brooklyn monument there. And if you're in a situation where you're taking enfilading fire and there's accounts where, whether it's Confederates who they're marching over ground where the 14th Brooklyn was before, and they write about it because of their uniforms, right? And you can see that if there is a massive Confederate buildup where that 14th Brooklyn monument is, and they had been taking enfilading fire, and then just a little bit of ways away is where you have your 5th New York, another Zouave regiment, and that's where kind of the attack is going to smash into the kind of the flank and start trying to roll up into Chin Ridge. You can kind of like really understand that, why are you not really getting the situation on the ground, right? Like it just kind of seems sort of odd, and obviously it does factor into, not to really dial back to a couple episodes ago, but it does kind of factor into what my opinion was, and definitely go back and listen to that one if you haven't already when we talked about Pope and Burnside. But it really kind of is inexcusable to say, like, this happened, why are you not seeing this? And I know it's harder, obviously, hindsight being 2020, and obviously would have been harder in the 1800s, but certainly difficult to understand. At South Mountain, the 14th would join their fellow New York regiments in Phelps' command as they assaulted Turner's Gap, the National Turnpike route. The 22nd, 24th, and 30th New York, along with the 14th, would be the Eastern Iron Brigade. Interestingly enough, if you recall, there being several Iron Brigades, but one in the east prior to the Midwesterners would be Phelps's brigade. The Midwesterners were coined according to their tradition at this engagement, so only fitting I mention that here, although I should point out that the Iron Brigade at Crampton's Gap is not entirely in possession of the rebel position after their assault, whereas the Federal troops at Turner's Gap are. Phelps' brigade would engage the Confederates from Richard Garnett's command. After a steep climb and a firefight, they would force their withdrawal. The Brooklyn Regiment, at one point being able to overlap their line. 7 killed and 13 wounded would be the toll for the New Yorkers, who were already down to maybe 100 men. Phelps' brigade would be in Abner Doubleday's division as Hatch was wounded during South Mountain. They would share the horrors of the Miller Cornfield with Gibbon and his Iron Brigade. The New Yorkers would advance and devastate Stark's command, facing Lawton's regiments as well. Supporting the Midwesterners, they would also receive the fierce charge of the Texas troops. A Brooklyn soldier would describe his experience. We were engaged just at the edge of the cornfield. As we advanced over a plowed field, we were obliged to lay down to escape the round shot and bomb shells, and when in the corn, had to lay down every few steps. And he may try to imagine us laying there, the balls going whiz, 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 when they step over us, and over our heads, and seeing the round shot tear up everything around a few steps off. At last we were ordered to rise, advance, and relieve another regiment who was firing into the rebels. I had fired about 12 rounds when the rebels came up to the brow of the hill, about 50 feet from where I was firing. A number of men said, "Don't fire, they are friends," but as soon as I saw them raise their pieces and fire, I fired my piece in that direction. When I discovered my brigade on the skedaddle through the corn, I thought it was time for me to leave. As I was running, I tried to help a wounded man off, but he was so heavy and helpless we were forced to leave him. I had just let go of his arm when a bullet struck him in the side. I tell you, it was rough running through that corn, the way those bolts were firing, perfectly careless whether they put an end to your life, present life or not. The battle continued to rage all day, although we did not have to go in again. This was the 17th or 18th. The rebels sent a flag of truce to bury their dead. On the 19th, we marched from near the battlefield to where we are now. They do say the battle extended 5 miles around. As we were on the march, we passed numbers of dead bodies in every conceivable shape and form. Some appeared as though they had fallen asleep, but most of them appeared as though they were in extreme agony. 12 would be killed, and another 15 wounded for the 14th during the fighting on the northern sector of Antietam. Showing the uniqueness of the regiment with a unique identity, however, Brooklyn would answer the call to replenish the ranks of the regiment. Following Antietam, 300 recruits would be raised to add to the depleted numbers. At Fredericksburg, the 14th would have a very similar experience to the Iron Brigade, still being part of Abner Doubleday's division. I've often questioned the usage of Doubleday at this sector of the Battle of Fredericksburg. You would think that the experienced New Yorkers, on top of the Iron Brigade from the west, would have been useful for any kind of operations. They would, however, be supposedly checking Stewart and his cavalry, which is odd considering that 2 pieces of artillery and then 1 piece of artillery essentially comprise the threat of this sector. The 14th would combine with the 24th New York in a feint to Port Royal, crossing the river with some brief skirmishing. We do have an account of that action as well. On the 23rd of last month, our regiment marched 20 miles through the pouring rain and crossed the river at Port Royal in boats. Captured several prisoners and returned again to camp, marched 41 miles through wind and rain, and accomplished our errand in 20 hours. What does he think of that, Sioux? Broke camp again on the 27th. Rained as usual, marched within 1 mile of Rappahannock and halted till 10 o'clock at night. They marched to the river under cover of darkness, and succeeded in crossing 8 o'clock in the morning of the 28th under heavy fire from the enemy. 24th Michigan crossed first in boats, charged on the rebels, and drove them point of the bayonet. Our regiment were deployed as skirmishers in the riverbank, had 25 wounded, none killed. The balls flew very thick around thy humble servant, but I haven't had a scratch as yet. I feel as though I was going to get through safe. Last night, part of our regiment were in the advance picket, had some heavy artillery fighting yesterday afternoon. Didn't do much damage, killed some few. I forgot to state that we took about 100 prisoners, several wounded. They coming in all the time. Much like the Iron Brigade, the 14th would see little action in the Battle of Chancellorsville. Importantly, Colonel Fowler had rejoined the regiment, but with his return, the time with the other regiments that they were brigaded with had come to a close. The 24th, 22nd, and 30th had seen their 2-year enlistments expire. So on the eve of the Gettysburg campaign, the 14th would be brigaded under Lysander Cutler with the 76th, 95th, 147th, and 56th Pennsylvania, along with the 7th Indiana. The Brooklyn boys were in good company. The 76th was from Albany, and the 95th from various New York City locations, both having served since Second Bull Run. The 56th likewise had seen service, and the 7th Indiana had been around since the early days of the conflict. The 14th would be part of Reynolds' First Corps as they approached Gettysburg in July of 1863. They would be responding on the 1st to Buford's cavalry delaying the oncoming rebel troops under A.P. Hill. Reynolds would have Cutler start to deploy his brigade along McPherson's Ridge. The 56th Pennsylvania and 76th would take the lead, with the 147th falling behind. The 56th, or the 2nd Wisconsin, are considered to be the regiment to have fired the first shots for the infantry regiment during the battle. Joe Davis's brigade of mostly Mississippi regiments, along with the 55th North Carolina, would be assaulting this portion of the ridge. It would be the 55th who would overlap the New Yorkers, collapsing the Union line. Cutler would realize the precarious position that the brigade was in and order a withdrawal. The Oswego 147th would not get the order and take heavy casualties before eventually pulling back. James Hall's main battery was a target of the rebels. The Magnolia Staters would gain the battery briefly, but a concentrated effort would send them back. This is where the Confederate troops would find themselves taking cover in the unfinished railroad cut. The 14th, along with the 6th Wisconsin and 95th New York, would make their famous charge, taking prisoners in the cut and dispersing those who were able to escape. Of course, we have the dispute over who was responsible for the charge that sees the Confederates retreat, whether it should belong to the 6th, 14th, or 95th. The 14th would remain in position and participate in the decimation of Iverson's Confederate brigade, along with Baxter's brigade and Cutler's other regiments. The 14th would have to retire due to low ammunition, but would reform. Along with the 6th, the 14th would end up extending the line in the Culp's Hill region at the end of the first day. Lysander Cutler had actually sent the 7th Indiana to occupy Culp's Hill, and they had dissuaded initial Confederate efforts to take that height. The 12th Corps would be able to occupy Culp's Hill in the meantime, George Sears Green becoming famous for its defense. While I have mentioned the 6th was lightly engaged, the 14th would also stabilize the Union position during the rebel night attacks. They would continue to be involved in the renewed Confederate efforts on the third day of battle, as Greene again requested reinforcements to assist. The fighting would be particularly fierce, with many of the New Yorkers receiving upper body wounds behind the trenches. The 14th would remain in position on Culp's Hill as the battle would come to a close. Overall, at the Battle of Gettysburg, they would suffer some 217 losses, 68% of those engaged. There is a real argument to be made. I know I keep saying that I don't want to keep comparing them to the Iron Brigade, but it's hard not to, especially considering they have a very similar service. But there is a real argument to be made that you have the 6th Wisconsin and you have the 14th Brooklyn. These are the two regiments that fight all 3 days, technically, for the Union, right? But there's a real argument to be made that the 6th Wisconsin has a real asterisk because they are very lightly engaged on one of those days, and the 14th Brooklyn is more heavily engaged on all 3 days. So you could kind of give them sort of the nod between the two regiments that have all 3 days. So if you're handing out the award there, I guess you could give it to the New Yorkers. There's also the famous charge on the railroad cut, whose idea it was. All the officers are coming together, and they all decide it's a good idea. So, who is it? Who deserves the credit? Obviously they all, are taking casualties on the assault in general. So, everyone kind of deserves a piece of the pie in that regard. But there's always kind of a debate over, whose idea it was, who is kind of the driving factor in that as well. So it's all a part of the Gettysburg lore, shall we say. As the Army of Potomac moved back into Virginia, the 14th would have some maneuvering in the Mine Run campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jordan of the 14th would be court-martialed for potential cowardice in the face of the enemy. He would be spared the charge of cowardice, but still found guilty of misconduct, although the president would commute the sentence and reinstate his rank. This was common, if you remember, we talked about this not too long ago, that many death sentences were pardoned on both sides. Still, there would be an execution, and we have an account of that. This perhaps is the saddest scene in a soldier's life, to be called upon to witness a strong man, under a bright sun, pay the penalty of a crime. In the heat of battle, one sees a comrade struck down, hardly noticing the event, unless it be a dear friend or brother, but, as in this instance, one had time to reflect, and thoughts go back to a time when the poor mortal who stands before us, his face blanched, with the awful certainty of a disgraceful death, induced by the most exalted motive, love of country, left home and friends, a gay dream, ambitious dream, to be realized in the strength of contending armies, to return home laden with honors, and with the consciousness of having performed the first of earthly duties. A volley from the muskets of his comrades shatters the dream, and the curtain drops over the scene. The 14th would be brigaded under James Rice for Mine Run and the Battle of the Wilderness, the latter engagement being in the third line for the fighting on the second day of the heavy engagement. Being in the third line of the brigade, though, they would be spared some of the heavier fighting. Following the Wilderness, the 14th would be part of the 1st Regiment engaging the Confederates near the Spindle Farm at Spotsylvania. But the service would end at Spotsylvania. The 3-year enlistment was up, and the 14th Brooklyn would leave the Army of the Potomac. In many ways, their experience is similar to many of the other regiments who had these impactful records, but then would leave before the conclusion of the war. Grant's army filled with replacement units. A.M. Wood would address the men he formerly commanded on their return. And we have that address here. Officers and soldiers of the 14th Regiment, veterans of the Army of the Potomac, it is with feelings of profound emotion that I greet you, not only in behalf of the citizens of Brooklyn, whom I represent on this occasion, but personally as your former comrade and commander. Your deeds of valor and of heroism on many a hard-fought battlefields entitles you to honor everywhere, but nowhere so much as here, in your native city, whose battle flag you have borne from the plains of Manassas on our 3 years' willing march to the glory fields of Spotsylvania, without one blot or stain of dishonor. Welcome, thrice home welcome. Your names are emblazoned imperishably high on the scroll of fame. Your deeds have passed into history, and your children's children shall read of them and be proud that they are descended from such noble men. And so we can draw a close on the 14th Brooklyn and their career in the Civil War. I think overall we can kind of see this regiment and see it through the lens of an impactful unit, as I mentioned, that serves in the Army of the Potomac through the thick of the fighting, the meat of the fighting, if you will. And I do think that it is an interesting look, because once we get to Spotsylvania, once we get into Petersburg, right, and you could maybe even argue Cold Harbor, then the war does very much change. The tone of the war changes. And I would even say, perhaps, and I've talked about it a little in the narratives and a little bit in these episodes as well, that maybe even the coverage of the war in the contemporary and even now, I think, kind of changes as well, where it becomes just a little bit different. it's not Gettysburg, it's not Antietam. It becomes a different sort of animal. And I think that seeing them and getting this kind of service, and it might be an interesting exercise to maybe look at a regiment that is very different, that maybe they are a latter stage regiment. Maybe they do kind of pick things up at say 1863, and then they're to the end of the war, and that might be something that we do, and I am kind of looking out for maybe a good candidate for that. But having this as being one of the more famous Zouave regiments, one of the more famous regiments in general, and they kind of start from the beginning, and then it is kind of abrupt. It's kind of a different look where it's Spotsylvania, and then it's done. Now we're going home, and it kind of also gives you an idea. And I know I sounded like a broken record in the narrative and beyond, where I kept saying like the Army is different. The Army of Potomac's not the same. The Second Corps is not the same. Obviously these aren't the same number of troops. The offensive capability is not the same. I sounded like a broken record. Probably you probably got sick of me saying that if you listened to all these episodes. But this kind of gives a great example of that, where these regiments are just leaving, right? All of a sudden you don't have them anymore. You don't have the same quality of individuals that you were relying on, and you're having rookie regiments that are larger regiments coming in, more manpower, but they're just not the same, not the same experience, and it takes a while to train up. And it's also a good look for that. And when we go through this regiment, where you have even a regiment that participates in First Manassas, and then you have all that time to create a functioning fighting force all the way in from 1861 into 1862, and then it becomes a quality regiment. You just don't have that time by the end of the war. So that's another great illustration of that by the time we get to the end of the service here. It's also unique in the sense that it is a militia regiment. It's not something that you see every day. So even though we mentioned how there is these similar experiences, or these experiences that are great examples of other regiments, right? We kind of went through those, but a militia regiment that does retain its kind of militia identity and is formed as this militia unit, it is kind of a different look, right? So it is kind of a different feel to it. So definitely wanted to highlight that as well, and definitely has more of a tie, I think, to the community. Not to say that these other regiments don't, but you see that throughout even kind of this brief accounting that I had here. And I know I didn't go quite so in depth with it, but definitely check out Frank Kalinda's book. It was a great source for me, and he did a great history of the regiment. But you definitely get that in that book, of just the ties to the community, and it's constantly kind of turning back to it. And that's a feel that I think is a little bit different when you have a regiment like this. So definitely wanted to highlight that as well with the 14th Brooklyn. So let's go ahead and call it quits there. We have another unit to check off our unit history series in the 14th Brooklyn. Next time we will be doing something a little bit different. We will be venturing beyond the Civil War and discussing one of our main characters that popped up throughout our story. We will be discussing the Battle of the Little Bighorn. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great week.